Welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. Very busy week for news, especially with Computex coming up in the next 2 weeks. You'll want to make sure you catch the coverage at the show of all the newest hardware for the rest of the year. AMD to announce Navi news at E3. Intel is facing some new vulnerability concerns, and there's tariff terror as manufacturers panic over the increased prices. So we'll pour one out for them. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their high-end thermal compounds. Thermal Grizzly makes cryonaut paste for high thermal performance and conductivity without being electrically conductive, so you don't have to worry about shorting components. Cryonaut is particularly good for replacing stock GPU pastes, as cryonaut is a non-curing compound. Learn more at the link in the description below. First news item for the show then. It's very cold right now. It's liquid nitrogen, by the way. Quick thanks for watching our stream the past weekend. We did 2 streams back to back, and they were for extreme overclocking on the Kingpin card, and we have more coverage coming up of that with liquid nitrogen for some sort of practical use cases, so you want to check back for that. Every order, by the way, of the signed mats during the stream has shipped at this point for the signed mouse pads, so thank you for picking those up. Paper's very cold. The first news item, AMD announcing Navi at E3. AMD already has a large event at Computex. We'll be covering it live from the event, and our recap of the coverage will go up shortly after the live stream concludes, most likely. But there's also an event at E3, and that's the Next Horizon gaming event, where Lisa Su, the CEO of AMD, will be hosting an event about gaming that doesn't technically say what the products are about at present, but it does say it will be upcoming products and technologies that will power gaming from PC to console to cloud for years to come. So it's going to be Navi, basically, is what we take away from that. We can easily infer here that this will include coverage of Navi. On our end, we'll probably be talking about it, assuming that's what's there. I mean, it probably is, because let's face it, AMD has announced a lot of its previous video cards at E3 and used very similar semi-ambiguous wording as is being used here. So previous cards announced at E3 by AMD include the Fury X, that would be the Radeon R9, the RX 400 series, for example, which was teased to press a bit before that in Macau at an event just before Computex in Taiwan. So based on AMD's history here, hopefully it's a video card. If it isn't, then we're very sorry for misleading you, but it probably will be. PlayStation 5 we already know will be using the 7nm Ryzen 3000 Silicon and some variant of Navi. This is officially known from Mark Cerny at Sony, so that's not a rumor. And that will likely have some more details at E3 as well. So we'll keep an eye out for both of these things. We intend to cover them if they are discussed, but either way, AMD has an event at E3, and it will discuss some kind of hardware. We just don't know precisely what it is yet. So stay tuned for that. Definitely something exciting to look out for, as it'll ramp up our coverage for the year. Ryzen 3000 is the next big thing for us, with Navi hopefully around the same time, but we'll see. It depends on AMD's launch schedules, and all we have to go off of right now are rumors from the interwebs. And that's always very reliable. Next one, Tariff Terror. A lot of manufacturers have reached out to us in the past couple of weeks, actually the past 4 days specifically, asking us if we're going to be covering the tariff increase. And this actually affects us too, GN, from a manufacturing standpoint, not just from a consumer standpoint. So the word we've gotten is that the new tariff hike increases the already hiked tariffs from 10% to now 25%. This is in the US. And this affects basically every consumer electronic or component you can buy. So some instances are not affected. For example, memory, last time we talked about this, was left unaffected for some reason. And then various combinations of keyboard and mouse, but not mouse or keyboard, were unaffected by the tariff hike. So those things won't change too much. Peripherals won't change too much. But you should expect to pay more for power supplies. The 25% increase will affect power supply manufacturers directly. We've spoken with now 4 of them. And the problem is that power supply manufacturing requires a special setup for the factories, and you can't just snap your fingers and spawn another one. So almost all of these are in China right now. As such, the power supplies will be impacted by the new 25% tariff, and you'll likely see that cost passed on to the consumer because the margin for a lot of these things is not that big already. So the increase, we'll see. It depends on the margin for each company, which power supply line it is. Some of them might be willing to make a loss leader in some instances, but you should expect to see some price increases. This will primarily affects the US market. It will affect Canada, as the US is a major port of entry, and then it can indirectly affect the rest of the world for component pricing, because the US is the largest consumer of components and is the sort of the benchmark for where manufacturers set their baseline prices. So this can affect everybody, but especially the US, and especially the companies in the US that are selling these products and making them. As for what's impacted, well, other than most of the metals used to make products like cases or everything, there's power supplies, video cards, motherboards, not to our knowledge, not memory. That may have changed, but as of now, not memory. And a few other things as well, like coolers, things made out of copper, aluminum, things like that. So how does this go down? Well, a couple of the factories are shifting some of their manufacturing. So a lot of the AIB partners, for example, make stuff in China. Actually, all of them make something in China at some point. But the final product is what matters the most for the impact of tariff, where it's coming from, where it was finally assembled. And at least one of the AIB partners has moved effectively all of its manufacturing operations to Taiwan from China. And so that board partner will dodge this tariff. They will have probably a price increase because it's not as cheap to manufacture in Taiwan as China, but they dodge the tariff. It's still not made in the US, it's made in Asia, because that's where the entire supply chain is. So this should surprise nobody. But it is made in Taiwan. So what you're going to see is some of the factories moving around. We've heard that Vietnam is another area of interest for potential factory spin-up and doing manufacturing there instead of China, and other parts of Asia, because they want to remain close to headquarters. They want to remain close to the supply chain for small components, for example. A lot of them are made in China or Japan or Korea, and so being close to those is beneficial. And this is something that you probably learned about in our factory tour coverage in the past couple of weeks, where a lot of those factories are miles away from each other, not thousands of miles away from each other, so that matters too. So we'll see. As far as what prices are affected, it'll depend on how quickly manufacturers move their manufacturing operations. We know that Gigabyte has a factory in Taiwan and has been shifting more and more of its production to that factory, has hired on staff there to increase the output of the Taiwan-based factory and hopefully dodge some of the tariffs as well. As far as how we're impacted at Gamers Nexus, our mod mats will get hit with this tariff, but only when they come into the port the next time. We don't have, we still have some inventory, so we're leaving our prices alone until that inventory is gone. And we did that last time too, and we also, last time we didn't have to increase the prices. So we took a big hit. I took a big hit on the margin when the tariffs went up last time, but we didn't have to increase our prices because we had enough margin left to still make a profit. With this next change, I haven't run the numbers yet, but it's going to be really close to forcing us to increase the prices, but we are going to try and keep them as low as we can. We'll probably eat some of our own margin and then might be forced to increase a couple bucks or something to balance it out, but yeah, it's not going to be fun. So that impacts everybody. Just keep an eye out for it. It'll primarily be when people import stuff, although some companies in the past have increased prices preemptively to profit from it ahead of time. But we are going to wait till we run out of product to evaluate that situation. Hopefully the tariff will be gone by then. More Intel vulnerabilities, and AMD okay for now. I think we did this in the intro, but it's fun. So let's pour some liquid nitrogen out. Researchers and Intel have recently disclosed a collection of new speculative execution attacks that are known as RIDL, or Rogue In-Flight Data Load, Zombieload, and Fallout included with that. You may have heard those names the last few days. So these new potential exploits are known collectively as MDS attacks, or microarchitectural data sampling attacks. And chips are affected ranging from the 9th generation, or 9000 series, which is built on 8th generation, which is built on, you get the idea, dating all the way back to CPUs from 2008, perhaps later. The latest round of side-channel attacks leverage similar techniques used in Meltdown and Spectre and to leak otherwise secure data from CPU buffers. Exactly how secure these attacks are depend on who you ask. Intel gives them a low to medium risk assessment per the CVSS standard, based on the complexity involved of pulling them off. researchers, however, estimate the attacks to be quite severe, going as far as recommending disabling hyper-threading and calling the attacks worse than Spectre. Media coverage is equally varied, with some outlets taking an almost alarmist tone to others being a bit more passive. The good news is that Intel does have mitigations in place, but as with previous software or OS level based mitigations, there tends to be a loss of performance, and it's mostly a band-aid fix. The only permanent fix to these flaws is new processors, and they need the in-silicon mitigations built into the actual hardware. AMD presently believes that due to the nature of its microarchitectural design, it is unaffected by these newest side channel attacks and vulnerabilities. However, as is the case, or as was the case with previous speculative execution attacks, there is a chance that alternatives can spin off as malicious actors begin to research options. So, different clones or variants could and probably will surface. Whether those affect AMD will obviously have to be evaluated as they appear. Additionally, these specific attacks rely on architectural elements unique to Intel at present. For the time being, there are no real-world exploits using these flaws that we're aware of, nor the researchers, out in the wild anyway. And aside from the proof of concept, you're probably safe at present. Still, consider any and all mitigations available to you. This would include things like BIOS updates for previous mitigations and Windows updates. Yes, we know it's terrifying, and fortunately for you, or maybe not, Windows probably updated in the middle of the last time you were doing something important on your computer. Nvidia sued for infringement of 5 semiconductor patents up next. So Nvidia appears to have found itself in a legal battle with Xperi and its subsidiaries, who contend that Nvidia is in violation of no fewer than 5 of its patents. For the unaware, Xperi Corp and its subsidiaries, which would include Invensys Corporation and Tessera Advanced Technologies, develop and license a wide range of intellectual properties. Xperi offers a range of technologies for pro audio, mobile image codes, and automotive. Invensys creates advanced packaging and interconnect IP for semiconductors, which brings us to the suit with Nvidia. The suit, filed with Delaware Federal Court, asserts that Nvidia's GPUs and supercomputers are violating 5 of the company's patents. Patent and IP law are often a slippery slope, but Xperi has defended these patents before against giant chip makers like Samsung and Broadcom. Xperi won on both of those accounts, with both Samsung and Broadcom entering into multi-year patent license agreements with Xperi. We'll see how this shakes out, but at this point it's doubtful Nvidia is going to discredit the validity of the patents in question. In an unusual and somewhat unprecedented move, Microsoft has circled back on its long-abandoned Windows XP to deliver a critical security update. This is aimed at deworming the once popular OS that users won't let die. And in fact, we saw Windows XP on use in several of the testing environments in China when we were touring those factories mentioned earlier, but it makes sense because if it works, don't change it, I guess, is the mantra. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. As part of its May 14th patch released on Tuesday, Microsoft delivered a critical security update for Windows XP, Windows Server 2003, and Windows 7, which a lot of you are still on, and head off a wormable flaw in remote desktop services. Microsoft cited a potential WannaCry-like exploit that it was targeting. The quote was, "Today, Microsoft released fixes for a critical remote code execution vulnerability, CVE 2019-0708. in remote desktop services, formerly known as terminal services, that affect some older versions of Windows. The Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP itself, is not vulnerable. This vulnerability is pre-authentication and requires no user interaction. In other words, the vulnerability is, quote, wormable, meaning that any future malware that exploits this vulnerability could propagate from vulnerable computer to vulnerable computer in a similar way as the WannaCry malware spread across the globe in 2017. While we have observed no exploitation of this vulnerability, it is highly likely that malicious actors will write an exploit for this vulnerability and incorporate it into their malware," explains Microsoft in a blog post. So the vulnerability doesn't yet affect, to our knowledge, publicly, Windows 10 or Windows 8.1 or Windows Server 2012 and beyond. But anything older than that, you might want to get your updates rolling, despite probably not wanting to. Biostar outs X570 chipset specs and highlights power delivery for the next AMD CPUs that should be announced at Computex. AMD's 500 series chipsets will accompany the Ryzen 3000 series processors at CES this year. We spoke with AMD at length about X570 and its new processors. And at the time, AMD was still uncertain whether X570 would come out immediately with Ryzen 3000 or would wait an extra month, because it just depended on motherboard manufacturers being able to get their operations online in time, and depended on the chipset, which was a big question mark, and AMD was still working on, especially with the PCIe 4 support. And obviously, speaking of that, the new X570 chipset marks both the arrival of PCIe 4 and AMD's departure from AMD in terms of chipset design, something that we reported on in the beginning of the year with our CES coverage. Biostar has revealed some details about its flagship AM4 X570 board, whether intentionally or not, ahead of Computex 2019. The racing X570 GT8 definitely looks like a Biostar motherboard, and that could be a good or a bad thing depending on your aesthetic preferences. However, the racing X570 GT8 highlights a focus on VRM construction and quality, as the board boasts a 12-phase power delivery system, no doubt meant to accommodate AMD's expected higher core count CPUs. The chipset itself is also actively cooled with a fan, which lends credence to the theory that the addition of PCIe 4 flattens the new chipset's TDP quite a bit over AMD's 400 series chipsets. And speaking of X570, we're going to have a lot of motherboard coverage at Computex this year. It's actually our leading story for the show. It's one of the first things we'll be looking at is X570 boards, so make sure you check back for that. But another point of interest here in this story is that the significantly higher memory frequency of DDR4 4000 after overclocking is supposedly going to be supported with the new platforms and CPUs. Memory support has been a growing pain for Ryzen platforms, especially at launch, but with the X470 revisions, with BIOS updates, and with the motherboard rollouts over the past year, it's improved significantly. We expect to see this continue to improve with X570, so it's good to see AMD overcoming some of its earliest limitations when Ryzen first launched. That's going to be it for this Hardware News episode. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus to get access to behind-the-scenes videos. And hopefully we're going to use the rest of this stuff soon for some additional overclocking of the Kingpin card in a practical sense. You'll see more about that later. I need to get rid of this. So let's just roll the outro.